Okay, so what does overexploitation look like? When a resource has been overexploited, we see smaller levels of harvest. Higher levels of harvest can render a species extinct. So this shows the collapse of the Atlantic cod. And so we see, we don't have good estimates of how many Atlantic cod there were through time in the Atlantic Ocean. What we do have data on is the number of fish that were brought in on boats. So this is fish landings in tons. And we can see it starts around 1850, that for a long time they just gradually increased the amount of cod that was taken. And then you can see around 1960, our intake of Atlantic cod increased dramatically to a high of 800,000 tons of cod. And then after not a very long time, it started to crash. And so the same amount of boats would go out and they were still bringing back some cod, but they couldn't find as many. And so there was a dramatic crash in the middle of the 1970s. We hit a temporary low. It went up a little bit and then it crashed dramatically in 1992. And right now, the cod still has not recovered. They're not extinct, but in some ways they're functionally extinct because it's very, very difficult to find enough Atlantic cod to support a market for them. So there's a common process that we see in overexploitation. One, a resource is identified. So this might be a kind of fish we've decided we want to eat. Two, a market's developed for this resource. So people go out and they try and get other people interested in buying this resource. They try to get restaurants to market it. They tell everyone how wonderful it is. Local people are enlisted to extract and sell the resource. Revenue is invested in technology. So people are like, wow, we're making lots of money by selling this fish. So we should develop these technologies or use existing technologies in a new way so that we can get more of this fish, so we can sell more of it and make more money. A transportation network is created so that we can move the fish around. Of course, it doesn't have to be fish. This is just an example. To get the fish more rapidly to different markets. So we might be freezing them and shipping them on boats or moving them on airplanes more rapidly, things like that, so that they can get to the markets, so places where people want to buy this resource. After a little while, the resource starts to diminish, so there are less of them than there were before. That often increases prices because it's more scarce, and that increases motivation for overconsumption. So sometimes as something becomes more luxurious seeming, it's the high-end fish that everyone wants to eat, the prices go up, and that means that you can make even more money if you catch some of it and are able to sell it. The resource diminishes to the point of market collapse, and so that means that there's just not enough fish available to support the market, or it becomes very, very expensive to try and get more of that resource because it's so rare. And so people need to turn to another region or another resource to exploit. So they need to find the new fish in the ocean to move over to exploiting instead. So effects of overexploitation, we see the bushmeat crisis, where we see sharp declines in wild animal populations due to collection for human consumption. And this is an example. Coronavirus is thought to come from these sort of wild animal markets, where when we have lots of different animals together, it can increase disease risk. But this is an example in Laos. This is a palm civet. And a lot of times these are taken. They can be endangered species. Bushmeat is often just another word for wild game, For some reason, in the United States, we say game, and then when we talk about developing nations, a lot of times we talk about bushmeat instead. It basically means the same thing. The efficiency for exploitation is often increased by habitat fragmentation. So as we talk about these different threats, we'll see that a lot of them often interact. And so roads will make inaccessible areas more accessible, so it's easier to get at some of these different resources. One effect of overexploitation is something that's been termed the empty forest. And this is the idea that some of our forests are still there, still intact, but they're not functioning the same way that they used to function because we've overexploited a lot of the large animals that would have lived in these areas. So these large animals become ecologically extinct or functionally extinct, which is a term we talked about I think briefly, and we'll definitely talk about more later. So there's a lot of neotropical rainforest where the vegetation is still there, but most of the large animals are not really there enough to perform their ecosystem services the way they were historically. And so this shows just an example in the Amazon. Areas that are unhunted, we see primate biomass at about 363, 364 kilograms per kilometer squared. But the areas that have been hunted, they're down to about 24 kilograms per kilometer squared. So that's an order of magnitude difference. And so that's pretty dramatic. And so that's pretty large effect that we can see from overexploitation. Before I move on, I wanted to point out that this might not sound like much, but some of these animals play really important ecological roles in these forests. So they might be pollinators, they might be seed dispersers. There are some trees that really rely on these large animals to move their seeds around, and if they become depleted, the trees live a very long time, so we might not see the effects of this depletion of large animals for a long time because trees live so long, but we might not have new trees to replace those in 50 or 100 years because we're missing these large animals. The effects of pollination might occur more rapidly, and we might see effects in the smaller plants that live shorter amounts of time than what we'll see in big things like trees. So, I want you to think briefly, does the USA still have overexploitation? A lot of times these examples talk about the ocean, or they talk about Asia or Africa, but what do you think? Do we still have a problem of overexploitation in the United States? The answer is yes. So we talked about the ocean. So marine fisheries, definitely the United States still plays a part in overexploitation. But we have some other things that relate to overexploitation. So we have some plants that are very valuable. An example is American ginseng. It's a medicinal plant. It is native to the southeastern United States, and you almost can't find it anywhere because people have gone out and collected it and sold it for money, and so it's very difficult to find now. Orchids are always vulnerable to overexploitation because they're so beautiful. They're thought to be very luxurious flowers to have around. This is an example of a pink lady slipper. It's not endangered or anything, but it is a common target for collectors. Another example is rattlesnake roundups. There are festivals every year targeting snakes and killing snakes. A lot of times they'll target rattlesnakes, but a lot of times there are other snakes. Not everybody knows how to identify snakes very easily, and they'll kill tons and tons of snakes. This picture shows a rattlesnake roundup, and there are just a lot of rattlesnakes in here. They're often starved, they're killed for sport, But I will say that the most common way that people get bit by venomous snakes is by trying to pick them up or kill them. So it's much, much more dangerous to collect them and do this than it is to see a rattlesnake and walk the other way. Um, Occasionally accidents happen, but in general, snakes perform far more ecosystem services for us alive than they do by killing them to prevent accidental cases where people are bit by venomous snakes. They control rodents and are worth millions of dollars every year in protection of people from disease and protection of crops from rodents. Another one is turtles for soup, and I copied a fairly recent article here about how people ate too many turtles. This is still going on. I mentioned it earlier. There are not limits in most states for how many turtles can be harvested. And that means that our turtle populations are way, way lower, and we do have endangered turtles in the southeastern United States that we need to manage that resource much more carefully. You'll find that we've done a lot better at managing mammal populations and duck populations that are more widely popular for hunting. But these other areas that people don't see as valuable, things like amphibians and reptiles, things like small plants, fish out in the ocean that we don't have great counts on, those are things that we're much more likely to overexploit in the United States. So we have not completely solved this problem here, though we do a lot better with other game species.